A silent cowboy finds a young woman stranded in a blizzard, only to realize she's the long-lost heiress he once loved and thought gone forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind howled across the wide Wyoming plains, sweeping great drifts of snow across the narrow dirt road that snaked toward Jesse Callahan's ranch. The world had gone white, the horizon lost in a blur of swirling frost. Snow clung to the edges of his hat and coat as he trudged through the knee-deep powder, boots crunching with every step. Out here, silence wasn't just a backdrop, it was a presence. It pressed in around him, broken only by the creak of the barn door and the muffled snort of the horses sheltering inside. Jesse didn't mind the silence. It was simpler than conversation, more honest than most words people used. He liked the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings, the steady work, the quiet evenings with nothing but the crackle of a fire and the distant howl of coyotes to keep him company. He'd built this life with calloused hands and stubborn grit, and though it was hard, it was his. But today the wind had teeth. The storm had blown in faster than expected, and the roads were already impassable. He'd spent the morning breaking ice from the water troughs, layering fresh hay, making sure the livestock were fed and sheltered. There was comfort in the routine until he saw the trail of tire tracks veering off the main road. They shouldn't have been there. No one should have been driving this way in weather like this. He followed the tracks on foot, every step slower than the last as the wind threatened to push him backward. Then, through the haze of snow, he saw it. A white SUV half buried in a ditch, its hazard lights blinking dimly through the storm. Steam curled up from the hood. One door hung slightly ajar. Jesse's breath caught. Someone was out there, alone. Without hesitation, he moved toward the vehicle, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the old revolver at his hip, not out of fear, but habit. As he neared the driver's side, he spotted a figure slumped against the seat, wrapped in a thick coat, motionless. He opened the door. The cold hit him like a slap, and then he saw her face, pale, beautiful, familiar. Jesse Callahan didn't believe in ghosts, but in that moment, he wondered if he was staring at one. The snow hadn't let up all afternoon. Thick, heavy flakes fell from a sky the color of steel, piling onto already buried fence posts and turning the ranch road into a pale ribbon that twisted blindly through the hills. Jesse guided his truck slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the heater vent. The tires crunched over ice-packed ruts, and the windshield wipers thudded a weary rhythm as they battled the blizzard. He didn't normally leave the ranch in weather like this, but a section of the eastern fence had gone down in the wind, and the cattle wouldn't wait for blue skies. He'd patched it quickly, fingers stiff from cold, cursing the gusts that nearly knocked him off his feet more than once. Now, he just wanted to get home, back to the quiet warmth of the fire, maybe a mug of coffee if the power still held. Then something flickered through the white. A pulse of orange, far off and low to the ground. Jesse narrowed his eyes, slowing the truck even more. Another flicker. Hazard lights. He eased off the gas, letting the truck crawl forward until the shape of a vehicle emerged through the curtain of snow. A white SUV, its front end buried in the ditch like a wounded animal. Steam hissed from beneath the crumpled hood. He pulled over, shifting into park and grabbing his coat from the passenger seat. The storm tore at the door the second he opened it, cold air knifing across his face. He tucked his collar up and made his way toward the vehicle, boots crunching through snow already ankle-deep. Up close, the SUV looked expensive, sleek lines, glossy finish beneath the frost. Not the kind of car you saw much around here. California plates, no movement inside. Jesse tapped the driver's window. Nothing. He tried the handle, unlocked. The door creaked open, and the cold rushed in. A woman sat slumped in the seat, her hair a dark tangle, her coat dusted with snow. She looked up slowly, eyes glassy with exhaustion, lips pale. I think I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. Jesse stared for half a second too long because he knew that voice, and he knew her. Her skin was ice cold beneath his calloused fingers. Jesse didn't wait for permission. There wasn't time for that. The storm was getting worse by the second, and the woman in the driver's seat was fading fast. Her head lolled to the side, eyes fluttering shut as a tremor ran through her frame. Shock. Hypothermia. Maybe worse. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, low. "You've got to stay with me, all right?" She murmured something, too soft to catch, then slumped forward. Jesse acted on instinct. He reached in, cradled the back of her neck with one hand, the crook of her knees with the other, and lifted her out of the seat. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made his jaw clench. The wind caught them as he turned, battering his coat and stinging his face. Snow whipped around them like a curtain drawn by an unseen hand. He carried her to his truck, shielding her body from the worst of the storm, and eased her gently onto the passenger seat. Her coat was soaked, the edges crusted with frost. He reached into the back for the thick wool blanket he kept for emergencies and wrapped it around her before slamming the door shut against the wind. Back behind the wheel, Jesse cranked the heat and glanced over at her. She was shivering violently now, a good sign, better than the stillness from moments before. Her lips were parted, her breath shallow but steady. He drove as fast as the conditions allowed, tires sliding on patches of ice, wipers fighting to keep the windshield clear. His mind spun faster than the snow swirling outside. He hadn't seen her in nearly a decade, not since the day she vanished from his life without a word. He'd buried that hurt deep, convinced himself she was gone for good. But now she was here, in his truck, in his life again. He looked over at her one more time. Savannah. He whispered her name like it might wake her, or maybe like he still didn't believe she was real. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and howling through the eaves like a thing alive. But inside the old ranch house, everything was still. The fire in the stone hearth crackled steadily, casting a warm, flickering light that danced across rough-hewn walls and time-worn furniture. Jesse sat across from her, elbows on his knees, watching the woman wrapped in his thickest quilt as she sat curled in the armchair closest to the flames. She hadn't said much since they got in, not that he expected her to. She'd only mumbled a soft "thank you" when he helped her inside, and then she'd gone quiet, eyes locked on the fire like she was trying to remember who she was, or maybe trying to forget. Jesse didn't speak either. Words didn't come easy for him, not even on a good day, and especially not when his chest felt like someone had wedged a stone in it. She looked older now, more refined, more tired, but it was her. He was sure of it, Savannah Hale, the woman he once thought he'd spend his life with, the one who disappeared without a goodbye, leaving nothing behind but the hollow ache of not knowing why. He stood up, moved to the kitchen, and returned with a mug of coffee, black, strong, and hot. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed. She looked up at him, startled, like she'd forgotten he was even there. For a beat too long, their eyes held. Then she looked away. "Thanks," she said softly, curling her hands around the mug like it might anchor her. He nodded and returned to his spot by the fire, leaning back in the creaky old rocker that had once been his father's. Outside, the wind slammed against the side of the house, snow piling higher by the minute. They were snowed in now, no question about it. She wasn't going anywhere tonight. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Memories neither wanted to unpack, questions Jesse didn't know how to ask. He should have demanded answers, should have said her name aloud, but instead he just sat there in the quiet, watching the flames and wondering how a ghost from his past had come back on a night like this. The firelight painted her face in soft, shifting shadows, catching in the curve of her cheekbones, glinting off the strands of damp hair that clung to her forehead. She hadn't said another word since taking the coffee, just sat there wrapped in the quilt like a woman trying to disappear into the fabric. But Jesse couldn't look away. He kept telling himself it couldn't be her. Not really. Maybe someone who looked like her. Sure. The world was big and coincidences happened. But then she shifted slightly, her eyes flickering toward him, and for a split second the mask slipped. And there they were, the same eyes that used to laugh under summer stars, that used to meet his across the hayfield when she'd sneak onto the ranch just to sit with him in the truck bed and talk about anything but the future. Those eyes had haunted him, long after he'd stopped admitting it out loud. There was something inside them now, though, something new. Weariness, loss, maybe even guilt. He looked down, jaw tight. It had been almost 10 years. People changed. He'd changed. But her eyes? They hadn't. And that was what made it harder, not easier. She caught him staring. "What?" Her voice was quiet, cautious, but not cold. Jessie hesitated, swallowed. "You look like someone I used to know." A flicker crossed her face, too quick to read, but there. She looked down into her mug. People say that sometimes. Faces get familiar in strange ways. He didn't answer, just rocked slowly in the chair, the rhythm steady and slow. He wasn't a man who pressed when it wasn't welcome, and right now she was a woman wrapped in silence, hiding behind a name she hadn't given him yet. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling. The eyes didn't lie, and deep down, something told him, no matter what she said or didn't say, that Savannah Hale hadn't stayed buried in the past. Not completely. She was here now, flesh and blood, breathing the same air, and whether she wanted to admit it or not, she remembered him too. The storm had eased into a steady rhythm outside, no longer violent, just relentless. Snow still fell in thick, quiet sheets, blanketing the world beyond the windows. Inside, the fire had burned low, its glow softer now, more golden than bright. Jessie had added another log a few minutes earlier, the hiss and pop of sap filling the silence. She was watching the flames again, her features calm on the surface but tight around the edges, like a woman bracing for something. Her hands clutched the mug he'd given her, now half empty and long gone cold. "I guess I should tell you my name," she said finally, her voice barely louder than the wind slipping under the door. Jessie didn't move. He just looked at her, his stillness louder than any answer. She turned her head slightly and for the first time really met his eyes. "It's Savannah, Savannah Hale." The name landed like a punch to the gut, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Jessie's throat tightened. His fingers curled against the arms of the old rocker as memories rushed forward uninvited. He'd been right. All along he'd known it, hadn't he? Known it in the shape of her face, in the way her voice curled around a word like it was something fragile. But hearing her say it, it cracked something open inside him, something he'd sealed off a long time ago. She waited for a reaction, some kind of recognition, or maybe judgment. But Jessie didn't speak. He couldn't. All he could do was stare, as the years between then and now closed like a door slamming shut behind him. Savannah shifted uncomfortably, mistaking his silence for something colder. "I didn't expect to end up here," she added, her voice rougher now. "Didn't expect to see anyone who'd remember me." Jessie stood slowly, walked to the fireplace and stoked the fire with the poker, the embers sparking back to life. Then he turned, his eyes darker than before, heavy with things he wasn't ready to say. "I remember," he said quietly. And then he sat back down. The name still echoed in the room, fragile and sharp. Savannah Hale, back from the past, and now sitting just 10 feet away. The fire crackled, low and steady, but Jessie barely heard it. Her name still hung in the room, curling through the air like smoke he couldn't breathe past. Savannah Hale. 8 years and it still hit like a hammer to the ribs. She hadn't said anything else since the moment she named herself, and he didn't ask her to. Instead, he sat there in the chair his father once favored, staring into the fire, letting the weight of her presence settle like snow on the roof, quiet, cold, and heavy. His mind drifted, uninvited, back to the last day he'd seen her. She was supposed to meet him at the crossroads, where the gravel lane met the main road out of town. Her note had been clear. "Run away with me," she'd written in quick, excited scrawl. A duffel bag packed, A borrowed truck gassed up. He'd waited for hours, nerves twisted into knots, checking the road every time headlights flickered in the distance. But she never came. No goodbye, no call, no letter, just silence. At first he'd worried, really worried. Had something happened? Had her father finally followed through on his threats? Savannah's family didn't take kindly to the idea of her slumming it with the Callahan boy, the quiet one who worked horses and fixed fences and didn't speak unless it mattered. He wasn't legacy. He wasn't wealth. He wasn't enough. But then, after the worrying, came the waiting. And after the waiting, nothing but a slow, grinding ache that turned into anger, then into something worse, indifference laced with regret. He'd buried her name the way he'd buried dreams of building a life with her. House, kids, porch swing, Sunday dinners. All of it had faded over time, like something he'd imagined in a fever dream that never quite made sense afterward. And now she was back, in his home, in his life. Like the universe had decided to reopen a wound just to see what kind of man he'd become since. Savannah shifted in the chair across from him, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. For a moment she looked like the girl he remembered, the girl who had kissed him in the hayloft, the girl who promised forever, and the girl who never said why she broke it. Jesse watched her carefully, like a man studying a wild horse, uncertain whether it was wounded or just dangerous. Savannah sat quiet, the quilt still pulled around her like armor, eyes trained on the fire but unfocused, as if she were watching something far away. Maybe she was. She hadn't looked at him since she said her name, and she hadn't called his. That was what struck him hardest. Not even a flicker of recognition. No startled gasp, no whispered, "Jesse?" Nothing. Just that soft, distant tone. Savannah Hale. So he said nothing. Let the silence do the talking. She'd always hated that back then, said he could go whole days without a sentence, unless it involved cattle or the weather. She used to tease it out of him with smiles, laughter, soft touches on his arm, back when her touch still meant something. Now she wouldn't even meet his eyes. Finally she spoke, voice flat and cautious. "This is your place?" He nodded once. "Has been for years." She gave a faint, non-committal hum. "Thanks for getting me out of the snow." Jesse leaned back in the rocker, arms folded, heart tight. She sounded like a stranger, looked like one too, in that polished coat and high-end boots. She didn't belong here, not anymore. But even as his chest coiled with old anger, something in him kept watching her. That same quiet part of him that had always known her moods, her silences. She was hiding something. Whether it was fear, shame, or just the truth, he couldn't tell. But it was there. "You said your name's Savannah," he said evenly, not letting emotion bleed into the words. "Don't recognize me, do you?" She blinked slowly, and for a second, just a second, there was something like panic in her eyes. Then it was gone. I'm sorry, I hit my head in the crash," she said carefully. "Things are fuzzy. Faces, places, I'm not sure." Jesse let out a slow breath through his nose. "Liar," part of him whispered. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she really didn't remember the boy she once promised to love. Either way, the truth was clear as the wind outside. They were strangers again. The snow had slowed to a quiet drift by morning, but the cold clung to the air like it had settled in for the long haul. Jesse left Savannah asleep on the couch, the fire still going strong, her breath soft and steady beneath the quilt. She hadn't said much more after that talk the night before, just claimed exhaustion and turned away. He hadn't pressed. He never did. The silence suited him fine, mostly. But now, alone in the back room he used as a workshop and storage space, Jesse found himself standing in front of an old dresser he hadn't touched in years. It was scarred from age and hard use, drawers sticking and handles loose. The third drawer from the top gave him the most trouble, just like always. He yanked it hard, and it finally gave, groaning in protest. Inside were the leftovers of a younger man's life. A beat-up ball cap, a frayed Letterman jacket from a school he barely remembered, a half-used notebook of sketches and engine diagrams, and tucked in the corner, almost buried beneath a yellowing bandana, was a small wooden box. Jessie stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The box creaked open like it had been waiting all these years. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, sat a ring. Simple, silver band. One small, square-cut diamond, nothing flashy, nothing extravagant. Just what he could afford after 2 summers of saving, working sunrise to sundown, and beside it, folded carefully, a photograph. It was them. He remembered the day. She'd leaned into him on the tailgate of his old truck, both of them smiling like they had forever stretched out ahead. Her hair had caught the breeze, his arm wrapped snug around her shoulders, back when life was easier, or maybe just foolish enough to feel that way. Jessie swallowed hard, staring at the faces frozen in time. That ring had been meant for her. The night she never showed, it had been in his pocket. He never gave it to anyone else. He never could. And now she was here, sleeping in the next room, like the past had never finished what it started. The fire had burned low again by the time Savannah stirred. Morning light filtered through the frosted windows, casting pale gold across the wooden floorboards. Jessie was at the stove, quiet as always, brewing coffee with the same slow precision he did everything else. She watched him from the couch, the blanket still pulled around her, the heat from the fire doing little to thaw the storm in her chest. He moved like someone who didn't waste words, someone who'd built a life around silence. But there was something else, too, something she couldn't shake. The shape of his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the coffee mug, the look in his eyes when he caught her watching. It felt familiar. Too familiar. Savannah sat up, drawing the blanket tighter around herself. "I think I owe you an explanation," she said softly. Jessie didn't turn, just poured 2 cups, placed one on the coffee table in front of her, then sat down in the chair across the room, his own mug cupped between his hands. She stared into the coffee, struggling for words. "I don't remember much," she said at last. "The accident, I hit my head. The doctor said it's temporary, but it's like parts of my life are foggy. Faces, places, things I should know." He watched her without blinking, his silence sharp as a blade. "But you," she added, barely louder than a whisper, "you're different." A muscle ticked in Jessie's jaw. "I look at you and I don't know who you are," she admitted, her voice catching. "But something about you, your voice, your eyes, it feels like I should, like I did, once." Jessie didn't speak, but his gaze didn't soften either. She reached for the coffee, fingers trembling slightly. "I found your name on a piece of mail near the door this morning, Jessie Callahan." She looked up at him, eyes searching. "Does that mean something to me?" He set his mug down slowly. The sound echoed like thunder in the quiet room. "It used to," he said. "Used to mean everything." And just like that, her breath caught, because somewhere deep inside the fog of her broken memory, those words struck a chord that wouldn't stop ringing. The kettle hissed low on the stove, its whistle just beginning to rise, but Jessie didn't move. He stood by the counter, hands braced on either side of the sink, eyes fixed on the snow-dusted pasture beyond the window. Behind him, Savannah sat at the table, staring into her untouched cup of coffee, her fingers tracing the rim like it might hold the answers she'd lost. "I remember," she said finally, so quietly it barely carried. Jessie turned his head just enough to let her know he was listening. "Not everything," she added, voice brittle, "but pieces. Enough." He came back to the table and sat across from her, leaning forward, elbows on the wood. His eyes were steady, waiting. Savannah swallowed, her throat tight. "The night I was supposed to meet you, I was going to. I had my bag packed. I was halfway down the stairs." She paused, drawing in a shaky breath. "Then my father was there, waiting." Jessie's jaw clenched. "He'd found the ring," she whispered. "He knew. About us. About everything." She looked up at him then, and the shame in her eyes hit harder than any lie ever could. "He threatened you," Said he'd ruin you, Jesse. Said he'd destroy your family, your land, your whole life if I didn't end it. Jesse's breath caught, his shoulders stiffening. You believed him? Savannah nodded, eyes glistening. I knew he could. He'd done worse to people with less to lose. And you had your ranch, your pride, your name. I couldn't let him touch that, so I left. Jesse sat back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. It was like someone had knocked the air out of his lungs. All those years, he'd believed she'd chosen to walk away, that she'd gotten bored or scared or just changed her mind, but this was something else entirely. You could have told me, he said, voice low, raw. I wanted to, she whispered, but I thought if I said goodbye, I wouldn't be strong enough to stay away. Silence stretched between them like wire, thin and taut, dangerous. And in that silence, Jesse realized the truth wasn't just painful, it was worse than being left behind. It was knowing she never wanted to go. The fire had burned down to glowing embers again, soft orange light casting long shadows across the kitchen. Jesse sat at the table, hands clasped loosely in front of him, as Savannah paced the worn hardwood floor. Her footsteps were slow, uncertain, like she was still figuring out how to speak the truth she'd kept buried even deeper than the rest. I didn't just leave because of my father's threats, she said at last, voice low. There's more. There's always been more. Jesse didn't flinch, didn't move, just waited. Savannah stopped near the window, arms wrapped around herself. After my father passed last year, I found out the full extent of what he left behind. Companies, properties, investments, and strings. Always strings. She turned to face him. I'm the sole heir to the Hale estate, everything he built. But he wrote in a condition, some final control from beyond the grave. Jesse raised an eyebrow, wary. What kind of condition? A faint, humorless laugh escaped her. I only inherit if I'm married by the end of this winter. Otherwise, everything goes to the board of directors, a group of men he trusted more than his own daughter. Jesse's brow furrowed, the pieces beginning to align. Savannah nodded as if reading his thoughts. That's why I was driving through Wyoming. I wasn't just running from the city. I was trying to disappear. I didn't want to marry someone just to meet a deadline. I didn't want the money on his terms. She stepped closer, voice softer now. I didn't even know I was near your ranch. I swear, Jesse, when the storm hit and the car went off the road, I thought maybe it was a sign. Maybe the past wasn't done with me yet. He studied her in the quiet, no flicker of greed in her voice, no calculation in her eyes, just tired truth. So you're here now, he said slowly, caught between your father's money and a future you don't want to buy. She nodded, eyes steady. I don't want the money, Jesse. I never did. I just didn't expect to find you again, not like this. The wind howled outside the window, but the silence between them felt louder and heavier. The storm didn't let up. By the second day, the snow had swallowed the world outside the ranch house. Drifts leaned against the porch like frozen waves. The road was long gone, and even the fence lines had vanished beneath the white. It was the kind of cold that crept in through cracks and settled in your bones. The generator hummed quietly, the fire burned steady, and inside the house, time moved slow. Savannah had taken to reading the old paperbacks stacked near the fireplace, Western novels Jesse's mother had once loved. She didn't say much, just curled up in the corner of the worn couch with a blanket draped around her shoulders. Jesse moved through his routines with quiet precision, feeding the horses, checking the generator, chopping wood, when the wind eased just enough to let him breathe. They spoke in fragments, short exchanges over coffee or dinner, passing thoughts in the hallway. It wasn't cold between them, just cautious, like two people tiptoeing around something fragile. Once she caught him watching her while she stirred soup on the stove. Their eyes met for a moment too long, and then she looked away, pretending she hadn't felt the weight of that stare. That night, they sat across from each other in the living room, firelight casting shadows on the floor between them. "You always live this quiet?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost beneath the crackle of burning logs. Jesse looked up from his mug. "Quiet's easier than most people." Savannah nodded slowly. "I used to think that too. Now I'm not so sure." A beat passed. Then another. "It's strange," she added, eyes distant, "being here, with you. Feels like we're the same people, but not. Like I know the shape of you, but not the details anymore." Jesse didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady, low. "You're not the only one trying to remember how to feel." They didn't speak after that, but the silence had changed, less like a wall, more like a thread pulling taut between them. They were still strangers in some ways, but something was shifting. And deep down, they both knew this snow wasn't the only thing they were trapped in. The snow had softened by morning, falling in lazy flakes that drifted past the windows like whispers. The world was still white, still quiet, but something in the air had changed. The sharpness was gone, replaced by a hush that felt almost reverent. Inside, the ranch house was warm and still, the fire crackling low, the scent of coffee lingering in the kitchen. Jesse stood by the back hallway, his hand resting on the doorknob that had remained untouched for years. Savannah was behind him, hesitant, curious. He didn't speak for a moment, just stared at the door like it was something he'd forgotten how to open. Then he turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was small, unfinished. The walls were half-painted a soft, pale green that had faded with time. A rocking chair sat near the window, its cushion worn but untouched. A crib, only partly assembled, stood in the corner, still waiting for the final pieces that had never come. Savannah stepped in behind him, her breath catching. "I started this the summer after you left," Jesse said quietly, voice rough at the edges. "Thought maybe if I stayed busy, it'd hurt less." She turned slowly, taking in the tiny shelf of picture books, the unopened box of baby clothes, the mobile, still wrapped in plastic. "I didn't know," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to," he said, then exhaled. "We didn't. It wasn't planned. I found out 2 weeks after you vanished. You were gone, and I didn't know where to send the words." Savannah's eyes burned, her throat tightening. "You were going to be a father." He nodded once. "Would have tried to be." She stepped closer to the crib, brushing her fingers lightly across the railing. "Was it a boy or a girl?" "Girl," Jesse said, barely above her breath. "Emily." Savannah turned to face him, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "I would have come back if I'd known. God, Jesse, I would have found a way." He didn't speak, just looked at her with eyes full of things too deep to say. And in the unfinished nursery, surrounded by what could have been, the weight of the past pressed between them like the snowfall outside, soft but inescapable. It was late. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the house was quiet except for the occasional groan of the wind pressing against the walls. Savannah couldn't sleep. The weight of the day, of the memories, of Emily's name, still ringing like a bell in her chest, made rest impossible. She found herself wandering, drawn down the hallway past the nursery, past the quiet rhythm of Jesse's deep sleep behind a closed door. At the far end of the hall, she stepped into what looked like a storage room, part office, part forgotten corner of a life lived mostly alone. The desk was sturdy, old, its surface scratched by years of work. On it sat a weathered box tucked between a coil of rope and a faded ranch calendar from 5 years ago. Something about it pulled her closer. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them. Some still sealed, others left open but never folded neatly. Each one had her name on it, written in Jesse's rough, blocky handwriting. No addresses, no stamps, just Savannah. She sank into the chair beside the desk, her hands trembling as she picked one up. June 3rd. You were supposed to be here by now. The truck's full of gas. I sat at the turnoff for 2 hours thinking maybe you got caught up or changed your mind. I'm trying not to think the worst. Maybe you're scared. Maybe I am too. Another, July 17th. Your father came by the ranch yesterday. Didn't say much. but his smile was enough. I think he knew I was still waiting for you. I hate that he gets to look at me like that. I hate that I'm still hoping. Letter after letter. Pain and confusion poured out in ink, raw, unfiltered, and heartbreakingly honest. October 5th. I started building a crib. I don't know why. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe it's a kind of goodbye I don't know how to give. Savannah covered her mouth, a sob slipping out before she could catch it. He had loved her in the silence. He had waited in the quiet. And he had written to her like she was the only home he ever had. The letters blurred as tears fell, one after another. She had broken something beautiful, and now, after everything, she didn't know if it could ever be whole again. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling gold across the snow-blanketed hills and painting the world in soft, blinding light. The storm had passed finally, leaving behind silence and a landscape untouched, glittering like glass. Jesse stood by the edge of the frozen lake that stretched out behind the old barn, his breath curling into the air. He held a pair of battered skates in one hand, not because he planned to use them, but because it felt like something from another life, back when winters weren't so quiet and hearts didn't carry so much weight. Behind him, Savannah appeared, wrapped in one of his old flannel coats, her boots crunching softly in the snow. "You used to bring me here," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I remember that, the lake, the way the trees looked like they were dipped in sugar." He gave a slow nod, eyes on the ice. "We used to race out there. You always cheated." She smiled faintly, stepping beside him. "You always let me." They stood in silence, watching the lake shimmer beneath the weak winter sun. Then Jesse reached into his coat pocket and held out one of the old skates. "Still got your size." Savannah blinked, startled, then looked at him with something soft and wary in her eyes. "You kept them?" "Couldn't bring myself to throw them out," he said simply. "Didn't know why. Maybe now I do." Moments later, they stepped out onto the ice, slow, careful movements, like they were learning something all over again. Savannah laughed once, lightly, as she caught herself from slipping, and Jesse instinctively reached out, steadying her with both hands. For a breathless second they stood close, faces inches apart. "I missed this," she said, voice barely audible. "Not just this place. You." Jesse's eyes met hers. "I tried not to." "But you did." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His hands were still on her waist, steady, familiar. The wind was soft now, brushing past them like a memory. She leaned forward slightly, forehead resting against his. And in that quiet, frozen moment, something finally began to melt. The sound came just after midnight, a low, distant howl that carried through the stillness like a warning. Jesse sat up in bed before the echo had fully faded, instincts snapping into place before thought had time to form. He was already pulling on his boots by the time the second howl rang out, closer now, sharper. From the other room, Savannah's voice called, soft but tense. "Jesse?" "They're near the cattle," he said, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. "Wolves." She didn't hesitate. A moment later, she appeared in the hallway, jacket half-zipped, flashlight in hand. "I'm coming with you." Jesse gave her a look, half protest, half surprise, but then just nodded. He didn't have time to argue, and truth be told, something about the way she stood there, steady, determined, felt right, like old memories slipping into new skin. They moved quickly across the yard, boots crunching on hard-packed snow. The moon cast a pale silver over the pasture, enough light to see movement in the shadows near the fence line. The cattle were restless, their low, nervous sounds breaking the quiet like fragile glass. Then came another howl. Closer, too close. Jesse raised the rifle. "There," he said, pointing toward the edge of the tree line. Eyes gleamed back at them, yellow, sharp, and unafraid. Savannah stepped beside him, holding the flashlight steady. "It's a big pack." "Too big," Jesse muttered. One of the wolves lunged toward the fence, and the herd stirred, pressing back in fear. Jesse fired a warning shot into the air. the crack echoing like thunder. The wolves hesitated, circling, but didn't retreat. "They're hungry," Savannah said, voice tight. "Desperate." "So are we," Jesse replied grimly. He fired again, closer this time, and Savannah flicked the light back and forth to keep the animals disoriented. After a long, tense moment, the wolves finally scattered, disappearing into the trees like smoke. Silence settled again, just their breath in the cold air. The cattle calmed slowly, still huddled together. Jesse lowered the rifle. "You did good." Savannah looked at him, cheeks flushed from the cold and adrenaline. "So did you." And as they stood together in the moonlight, shoulders brushing, hearts pounding, it was clear they weren't just protecting the ranch tonight. They were learning how to protect each other again. The storm had passed, and the ranch was quiet again, blanketed in a soft hush that only snow could bring. The world outside was still, but inside the old house, warmth clung to the walls and the scent of pine wood lingered from the fire. Evening had settled in, soft and amber, and Savannah found herself in the kitchen, folding dish towels just for something to do with her hands. From the living room, Jesse's low voice drifted in, steady, quiet, and low like it always had been when he thought no one was listening. She paused, listening harder. It was a melody. Familiar. A tune hummed more than sung, wrapped in a rhythm that reached past years and miles. Her breath caught before she even realized why. The lullaby. Her mother used to hum it when she was small, before the world turned sharp and brittle. But more than that, Jesse used to hum it too. Back when they were kids, sitting by the lake under the stars. She'd told him once how it soothed her, how it reminded her of being safe. And he remembered, even then. Savannah dropped the towel and stepped softly toward the living room, the sound pulling her like a thread. Jesse was seated in the old rocker, boots crossed at the ankle, eyes half closed, unaware he was unraveling something in her. She stood in the doorway, silent, hand resting on the frame. And then, like a dam breaking, it hit her. The fairgrounds, his hand in hers during her mother's funeral, their first kiss by the hay bales, clumsy and perfect, the night they'd carved their initials into the barn door, the way he looked at her like she was something sacred. She remembered everything. Her breath hitched, and Jesse looked up, surprised by the sound, their eyes locked. "I remember," she whispered, voice shaking. "All of it. You, us." Jesse didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes softened in that way she'd always known, that way that used to feel like home. Savannah stepped closer, her heart wide open. "I never stopped loving you, Jesse, not for a second." And in that moment, the years between them fell away, replaced by something timeless, something true. Love, never forgotten. Love, finally remembered. The wind had stilled outside, and with it came a rare, full quiet. Not the uneasy kind that hung between people who didn't know what to say, but the deeper kind, the kind that followed truth. Savannah sat on the couch, knees drawn to her chest beneath the worn quilt, firelight flickering against her face. Jesse sat in the old armchair across from her, elbows resting on his thighs, watching her the way a man watches the edge of a cliff, knowing he could fall again at any second. "I need to tell you everything," she said quietly, voice frayed around the edges. Jesse didn't answer, just waited. Savannah took a breath, and the words came slowly, like stones lifted from a deep, cold well. "My father knew about us long before I told him," she said. "He had me followed, read my messages. He knew we were planning to leave together." Jesse's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "He called me into his office the night before we were supposed to meet," she continued. "He poured a drink like it was any other night, sat across from me like he hadn't already decided how the rest of my life was going to go." She looked at Jesse then, her voice trembling. "He said if I didn't disappear, if I didn't leave you without a word, he'd ruin you. Said he'd take your land, your family's name, everything. He had the money, the reach, the lawyers. I believed him, and I was scared." Jesse's eyes darkened, not with anger, but something heavier, grief that had never had a place to land until now. "I thought I was protecting you," she said. "I thought if I left, he'd lose interest, that he wouldn't come after you if I wasn't in the picture. I packed a bag that night, but instead of coming to you, I got on a plane. He'd already booked the ticket." Her voice cracked. "I hated myself for it every day." Silence followed, thick and aching. Jesse stared into the fire, his fingers curling loosely around the edge of his chair. "You should have told me," he said, low and steady. "I know," she whispered, "but I thought walking away was the only way I could keep you safe." Jesse looked at her then, and for the first time, she didn't see blame in his eyes. Just pain, and maybe, beneath it all, a flicker of something that still hadn't died. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snowy fields as Jesse made his usual rounds. The storm had passed days ago, but the cold still bit deep, the kind that settled in and stayed a while. He walked the fence line with a practiced eye, checking for breaks, loose wire, or signs of wildlife. But something felt off. The tracks near the far gate weren't from cattle or deer. These were boot prints, too clean, too recent. He crouched down, touched the compressed snow, fresh, within the last few hours. Jesse stood, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling in his gut coiled tight. He wasn't the kind of man to jump at shadows, but he trusted his instincts, and right now they were telling him someone had been watching. Back at the house, Savannah was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she stirred something on the stove. Jesse walked in without a word and set his rifle by the door. She turned, caught his expression, and stilled. "What is it?" "There were tracks by the north gate, Judd," he said. "Too deep in for a lost hiker or someone passing through." Her face paled. The spoon in her hand clattered into the pot. "No," she whispered. "He wouldn't." Jesse stepped closer. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "My uncle, Gerald Hale. After my father died, he was supposed to step back from the company, let me take control. But he fought it. Hired lawyers, tried to prove I was unstable. That's when the inheritance clause showed up, hidden in the paperwork. He said it was my father's final wish, but I think—" "You think it was him all along," Jesse finished. She nodded. "If I don't marry by the end of winter, the estate goes to him. And he'll do anything to make sure that happens, including making sure I vanish again." Jesse's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching beneath the skin. "He's following you." "Or watching you," Savannah said quietly. "He knows about you now, that I'm here." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Jesse turned toward the window, eyes sharp, voice steady. "Let him come." The cowboy was done waiting in the dark. This time he'd fight for what mattered. The calendar on the kitchen wall hadn't meant much to Jesse in years, just a place to mark down cattle vaccinations, hay deliveries, the occasional supply run into town. But now, every red X felt like a clock ticking louder with each day that passed. Savannah stood in front of it, arms folded, eyes locked on the circled date. February 28th, her birthday, and the last day she could claim her father's inheritance. The last day she could take back control from the men who thought they could run her life, even from the grave. "You've got 12 days, Jesse said from behind her, voice low but firm. "Then what?" She didn't turn to face him right away, just stared at the date like it might disappear if she looked hard enough. "Then everything goes to Gerald, the board, the lawyers, all of it." Jesse leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "What happens if it does?" "I lose more than money." Her voice was soft. "I lose my father's legacy, the people who work for that company, the promises I made to them before I ever knew what was in the will." He studied her, the way her shoulders tensed just slightly, like she was holding up more than just pride. "And the only way to stop it is to get married." She turned now, meeting his gaze. "Legally married, yes. Before midnight on my birthday. With proof. Paperwork. Witnesses." Jesse didn't flinch. "That why you came here? Hoping I'd agree to help?" "No," she said quickly, a flicker of shame in her voice. "I didn't even know I was coming to you. I just ran. I was trying to disappear from it all, not drag you into it." Silence fell between them, but this time it wasn't sharp. It was heavy, honest. "I'm not asking for a favor, Jesse," she added, quieter now. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to be somewhere that felt real, somewhere I didn't have to pretend." Jesse nodded slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. 12 days, he said again. And though neither of them said it, they both knew. Time was running out, and hearts weren't the only things on the line. The sun had dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-draped fields. The ranch had gone quiet again, tucked into the hush that always came with nightfall. Savannah stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes scanning the fading horizon. Her breath clouded the air in soft bursts, her mind spinning faster than the wind, curling through the trees. 12 days, now 11. The deadline pressed on her like a weight she couldn't shrug off, no matter how far she ran or how close she stood to Jesse. She didn't hear him approach, just felt the boards creak beneath his boots, and then the familiar warmth of him standing beside her. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. That wasn't his way. But he had a presence, quiet and grounded, and when he was near, everything else seemed to slow down. "I don't want you to feel trapped," she said softly. "I won't use you to fix something I never meant to drag you into." Jesse didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the fields, snow glowing pale under the moonlight, as if trying to decide whether words were worth it. Then, without ceremony, he reached into the pocket of his worn flannel jacket and pulled something out. A small velvet box. Savannah's breath hitched. He didn't open it, didn't get down on one knee, just held it out to her, resting in the calloused palm of his hand. She stared at it, then at him. His face was still, unreadable. But his eyes, they said everything. The pain he'd carried, the hope he'd buried, the love that had never really left. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and took the box, fingers brushing his. Slowly she opened it. Inside, the same ring he'd once bought with 2 summers of hard work. Simple, honest, unchanged. "I kept it," Jesse said, his voice low, almost rough. Tears welled in her eyes, unspoken emotion crashing in waves beneath her ribs. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know." And with that, no vows were exchanged, no promises spoken aloud. But in that moment, on a quiet porch beneath a cold Wyoming sky, it was a proposal just the same. Savannah stood at the window, suitcase by her side, coat already buttoned, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out into a world that had suddenly vanished again. The snow had started as a whisper, fine flurries drifting lazily across the fields. But within an hour, the wind had picked up, and now it screamed across the land like something wild and angry. Thick white sheets whipped through the air, blinding and heavy, devouring the road that led into town. Jesse stood behind her, jaw tight, radio crackling faint static in his hand. The voice on the other end had just confirmed what he already feared. "All routes closed past the valley," the deputy had said. "Visibility's shot. Power lines down. No one's getting through tonight." He clicked it off and set the radio down gently, like if he moved too fast it would make everything worse. Savannah turned, eyes wide with frustration and fear. "We were supposed to go today. The paperwork, the license, everything's ready. If we wait too long—" "I know," Jesse said quietly. She looked at him, eyes pleading. "We're running out of time." He crossed the room slowly, steady as ever, and reached out to take her cold hands in his. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." She tried to believe that, but as the wind screamed louder and the snow fell faster, it was hard not to feel like the world was pushing back, like time itself was conspiring against them. Savannah dropped her forehead against his chest, breath shaking. What if this is it? What if this storm takes the chance away for good? Jessie's arms wrapped around her, grounding her like they always had. Then we wait it out, and when the sky's clear, we finish what we started. Outside, the snow kept falling, relentless and silent. Roads buried, plans delayed. But inside there was warmth, a fire. Two people standing in the quiet, holding fast to something that couldn't be undone by wind or time. They were trapped again, but this time they weren't alone. The storm pounded the roof with relentless force, wind howling like it was trying to tear the past off the walls. Snow pressed against the windows in thick, ghost-like swirls, turning the world outside into a blur of white and noise. But inside the old ranch house, everything was still. Savannah sat cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in an old quilt, her eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper, fear, maybe, or doubt, or hope, fraying at the edges. Jessie stood across from her, leaning against the mantel, hands tucked into the pockets of his flannel shirt, staring into the flames like they might speak first. The silence stretched, full and heavy. She broke it. "Say something." He looked up slowly, eyes locking with hers. "You think I don't want to?" His voice was quiet but thick with something that had waited too long to surface. "You think I haven't spent years trying to figure out what I'd say if I ever saw you again?" Savannah blinked, breath caught somewhere between a sob and a question. "I was angry," Jessie continued. "When you left, hurt. But more than that, I was scared, because I didn't just lose you. I lost what we were building. I lost us. And I never knew why. I didn't get to fight for you. I didn't get a chance to hold on." She stood slowly, heart pounding. "I kept quiet because it hurt too damn much to speak your name," he said, voice deepening. "But I never stopped loving you, Savannah. Not for a day. Not even when I tried to." The words landed like thunder in her chest, louder than the wind, louder than the storm. He stepped closer, every inch a man who didn't speak unless it mattered. "I loved you when you were gone. I loved you when I thought you forgot me. I love you now, with snow falling outside and your hair messy and your heart still half-guarded." Savannah's tears came then, quiet and full. "You still mean it?" He nodded, a small, sure thing. And with the storm raging outside, she crossed the room and kissed him, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Because sometimes love doesn't have to shout, but when it finally speaks, it's louder than anything. By morning, the wind had died. It didn't stop, just softened. The sky was still a heavy gray, but no longer the kind that threatened to collapse. Instead, it hung low and quiet, as if the storm had finally exhausted itself. Outside the ranch house, snow lay deep and untouched, blanketing the world in silence. A new kind of silence, the kind that follows survival. Jessie stood on the porch with a thermos in one hand, his breath rising in slow clouds. He scanned the horizon like a man used to waiting, used to watching the weather decide the course of his life. And for the first time in days, the road looked passable. Not safe exactly, but open. Inside, Savannah buttoned her coat with shaking fingers, her nerves twisted tight. The ring Jessie had given her rested on her finger now, snug and warm despite the chill in the air. Not a proposal for the sake of saving her future, but a promise. One born of history and heartbreak, and something more stubborn than both. When Jessie stepped back through the door, their eyes met. "It's time," he said simply. The drive into town was slow, the truck rattling gently over packed snow and half-frozen slush. The world looked like a postcard, frosted trees, white hills rolling into the horizon, fences peeking through like ribs under a blanket. They didn't speak much on the way. They didn't have to. At the courthouse, the clerk looked up from her desk, eyebrows lifting as they approached, snow-dusted and wind-blown, and unmistakably together. "We called a few days ago," Savannah said, her voice steady. "Marriage license." The woman blinked, then smiled. "Cutting it close, huh? Today's the deadline." Jessie slid the documents across the counter. "We don't do things early out here," he said, voice calm as ever. Minutes later, with a witness from the county office and snow still clinging to their boots, they stood hand in hand before a tired but kind-eyed judge. And when he asked if Jessie Callahan took Savannah Hale to be his wife, Jessie didn't hesitate. "I already do," he said. No fanfare, no crowd, just truth spoken softly in a quiet town at the end of a long road. They made it, just in time. The town hall was nearly empty, just the faint echo of footsteps and the muffled hum of an old heater trying its best to chase the chill. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow across worn tile floors and faded bulletin boards covered with flyers no one had taken down in years. It wasn't a place meant for fairy tales. But that didn't matter. For Jessie and Savannah, standing side by side in front of a plain wooden podium, this moment was more real than anything wrapped in lace or lit by chandeliers. No flowers, no music, just two people, a quiet promise, and a life they'd both thought lost. The county judge adjusted his glasses and smiled kindly. "You sure you two don't want to wait for something fancier?" Jessie looked at Savannah, her cheeks pink from the cold, her hand steady in his. "This is just right," he said. The judge nodded and began. The words were familiar, almost forgettable in their formality, but Jessie held on to every one of them. So did Savannah, because this wasn't about ceremony. It was about truth, about finding each other again after years apart, after silence, after storms. "Do you, Jessie Callahan, take Savannah Hale?" "I do," Jessie said, voice quiet but certain. "And do you, Savannah Hale, take Jessie Callahan?" "I always did," she whispered, smiling through the tears welling in her eyes. The judge chuckled gently, closed the book, and made it official with the scrape of his pen against the certificate. "Well then," he said, offering a handshake, "you're husband and wife. Congratulations." They signed their names, ink drying fast on the page that would change everything. The clerk in the corner snapped a quick photo for the file. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't meant for show, but it was real. And when Jessie slipped the ring onto Savannah's finger once again, it felt less like an ending and more like a return, like finishing a sentence that had waited 8 years for its final word. They walked out into the snow together, unnoticed by the world, just as they wanted it. The letter arrived 2 days later, delivered by a courier in a black SUV that looked wildly out of place on the long dirt road to the ranch. Savannah stood on the porch, envelope in hand, the weight of it heavier than the paper inside could ever explain. Jessie leaned against a porch post, arms crossed, watching her, but not pressing. That was the thing about him. He always gave her space, even when the world didn't. She opened it slowly, fingers steady despite the ache in her chest. Inside, confirmation. Her inheritance, her control of the Hale estate, the board's reluctant acceptance of her position, a summary of assets, staggering numbers, property lists, power written in language only attorneys could twist. It was done. She had it. All of it. And yet, Savannah felt nothing but tired. She glanced up at Jessie, who stood quiet in the pale light of morning, snow melting in slow drops from the porch rail. His flannel sleeves were rolled to his elbows, dirt still under his nails from fixing the fence that morning. He hadn't changed, wouldn't change. And she realized that was the part of her life that mattered. Not what was in her name, but who stood by her side. "They gave it to me," she said, voice flat. Jessie didn't move. "You surprised?" "No." She folded the letter and looked out at the pasture. "But it doesn't mean what they think it does." He said nothing, waiting. She turned toward him, eyes clear now. "I'm not going back to that world, Jessie. Not the boardrooms, not the backstabbing, not the press releases. Let them have the title. I've already got what matters." His brow furrowed. "You sure?" Savannah walked up to him, sliding her hands into the space between his arms and his chest, grounding herself in the weight of him. "The empire means nothing without you. It never did." Jessie didn't smile, not fully, but his hand came up to brush her cheek, and his eyes softened in that quiet, soul-deep way of his. "You always were stubborn," he said. "So are you," she replied, leaning in. "That's why we work." And out on that porch, far from the world she'd inherited, Savannah Hale chose the only legacy she wanted to build, one where love was worth more than anything money could buy. The truck rumbled down the long dirt road, tires cutting twin tracks through the snow-packed earth. The ranch came into view just as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the fields and painting the white world in hues of amber and rose. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the barn stood tall and steady, weathered by time but still proud, just like the man behind the wheel. Jessie glanced over at Savannah. She was quiet, eyes on the landscape like she was memorizing it all over again, but the way her hand rested in his, fingers laced tight, spoke louder than words ever could. They weren't driving back to where it all began, not exactly. They were driving forward to something new, something reclaimed. Home. He parked by the porch, killed the engine, and sat for a moment as the silence settled. No storm, no tension, just the hush of coming back to a place that had been waiting for them both. Savannah stepped out, her boots crunching softly on the snow, as she looked up at the ranch house. "It feels different," she said. Jessie came around to meet her, hat pulled low against the breeze. "'Cause you're seeing it through new eyes." She turned to him, smile tugging at her lips. "No, I think I'm seeing it through true eyes, for the first time in a long time." They climbed the porch steps together, side by side, not as strangers, not as shadows of what might have been, but as something stronger, weathered, tested, whole. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and coffee and warmth. The fire was already lit, casting golden light across the walls. Savannah slipped off her coat, hung it beside his, and looked around like she was settling into more than just a room. Jessie stood behind her, arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're home now," he murmured. She leaned into him. "We both are." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, light, no longer a storm, and this time they weren't waiting for the weather to clear. They were already where they belonged. The wind was calm that morning, the kind of quiet that made you pause before stepping outside, like the land itself was holding its breath. Jessie stood by the fence line with a hammer in one hand and a new cedar post balanced against his hip. The earth was still hard beneath the snow, but not frozen through, just enough give to make the work slow and steady. Just the way he liked it. He dug in the post, tamped it down, and began securing the rail with practiced ease. Fence work was honest, no guessing, no mind games. You put something broken back together, and when you were done, it held strong. Didn't matter what came next, it just stood. Behind him, Savannah walked toward him across the pasture, wrapped in one of his flannel shirts, her boots crunching softly in the snow. She didn't say anything at first, just stood on the other side of the fence and watched him finish. "You're quiet this morning," she said eventually, her tone light but curious. He wiped his hands on his jeans, glanced up at her. "Thinking." She tilted her head. Dangerous habit. Jessie gave a faint smile. "Used to be." He leaned on the post, eyes scanning the horizon, the fields, the barn, the life he'd spent years building out of sweat and solitude. "I didn't realize how small I'd made my world until you showed up again." Savannah stepped closer. "And now?" He looked at her then, really looked, at the lines in her face softened by forgiveness, at the hope that lived quietly behind her eyes. "Now I'm wondering if I gave up on more than just you. I think I stopped believing things could be good again." She reached out, her hand slipping over his where it rested on the fence. "I didn't come back to be forgiven, Jessie. I came back to try, and if you're willing to try to, He didn't answer right away, but then, with a slow nod, he squeezed her hand. "I'm not just fixing fences anymore," he said. And in those quiet words, spoken in the middle of a Wyoming field with nothing but sky above and her beside him, Jesse Callahan let the past go, one post at a time. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paint, a mix of memory and new beginnings. Sunlight filtered through the frosted window panes, dust motes spinning in the golden hush. Jesse stood by the crib, screwdriver in hand, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The half-assembled frame sat between them, still missing the final rail. Savannah knelt beside a box of tiny screws and instructions, her growing belly just beginning to curve beneath her flannel shirt. She caught him watching her and smiled. "Don't look at me like I'm fragile, Cowboy. I'm pregnant, not made of glass." Jesse smirked. "I wasn't. Just wondering how you're so calm with these instructions. They read like a puzzle with half the pieces missing." "Good thing I'm smarter than I look," she said, tossing him the next piece. "Now scoot. That one goes here." They worked together in a quiet rhythm, the way they always seemed to. No need for many words, just shared focus and something deeper unspoken between them. Outside, the wind whispered across the snowbanks, but inside the house there was only the soft sound of tools, light laughter, and the occasional clatter of a bolt rolling across the floor. Savannah stood when the frame finally came together. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, her fingers brushing the small etched detail Jesse had carved into the side. A pair of initials. E.C. "Emily Callahan," she whispered. Jesse came up behind her, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. "That name's had a home here for a long time." She turned, eyes wet, but smiling. "And now it has a heartbeat." He reached down, one calloused hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. "I didn't think I'd ever build this room," he said. "Thought it'd stay unfinished forever." Savannah leaned into him, her voice soft. "It was waiting, like we were." The crib stood solid now, not just a piece of furniture, but a promise made in wood and hands and second chances. A place waiting for new cries, new dreams, new life. And in that quiet little room at the end of the hall, Jesse and Savannah finished what they'd started years ago. Not just a nursery, a home. The snow came early that year, soft and heavy, blanketing the land in silence. But unlike the winters before, where the wind had howled through empty halls and shadows stretched longer than they should, this one felt different. This one felt alive. Inside the ranch house, the fire was always burning, crackling warmth into the rooms that used to feel too big for one person. The scent of pine logs and coffee filled the air, and laughter, genuine, easy laughter, echoed off the wood-paneled walls like it belonged there. Jesse stood in the kitchen, brow furrowed in deep concentration, as he attempted pancakes for the third time that week. Savannah sat at the table, one hand resting lightly on her growing belly, the other cradling a mug of tea as she watched him with amusement. "Don't flip it yet," she warned, grinning. "I got this," Jesse muttered. The pancake hit the pan with a splatter that made them both laugh, loud and full. Later, they bundled up and walked the fence line together, Jesse's arm draped over Savannah's shoulder, their boots crunching through fresh snow. He pointed out where the foxes had passed, where the cattle huddled beneath the lean-to, and where the pond had frozen just enough for skating. She listened, leaning into his warmth, their silence comfortable and full. Nights were slow and golden, blankets, board games, late-night stories whispered by the fire. Jesse began reading aloud from old books she'd found in the attic, his deep voice steady and soft, his words wrapping around her like a second quilt. The pain didn't vanish, the past didn't forget itself. But something in the quiet of this winter healed them both. Forgiveness settled like the snow, soft, steady, building something beautiful with time. On Christmas morning, Savannah gave Jesse a small hand-carved sign, "The Callahan family, est this winter." He didn't say much when he opened it, but she saw the way he traced the letters with his thumb, eyes a little shinier than usual. This wasn't the life they planned, but it was the life they built, together. And in the stillness of their first winter as husband and wife, love took root in every snow-covered corner of the ranch. The sun was setting slow behind the western ridge, painting the snow-covered pasture in soft strokes of gold and rose. The sky stretched wide and open, endless in that quiet Wyoming way. Jesse sat on the porch swing, one hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee, the other resting across the worn wood rail. The boards beneath him creaked with each gentle sway, a sound he'd grown used to, like the wind through fence posts or the hush of horses in the barn at dusk. Inside he could hear Savannah humming as she sorted baby clothes in the nursery. The sound drifted out through the open window, light and low, like a melody from another lifetime. He took a slow sip, gaze fixed on the horizon, and let the weight of it all settle in his chest. For so long he'd thought she was gone, truly gone, not just out of reach, but lost in that cruel way life sometimes takes people without asking. There were nights he'd stood right here on this very porch, watching that same stretch of land, wondering if he'd ever stop missing her. And now, she was home, not just in body, not just in name, but in heart, in presence. In every corner of this place, her laughter echoed, her hands had touched. She belonged here, like she always had, like maybe she always would have, if the world had been a little kinder. Jesse reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph he still carried, faded, creased at the edges. Him and Savannah, young and full of the kind of fire that thought love could outpace anything. He looked at it, then at the light spilling across the pasture. "Guess forever just got delayed a little," he murmured. Behind him the door creaked open. Savannah stepped out, wrapped in his flannel, her hands resting over the curve of her belly. She leaned against the rail beside him, eyes on the same sky. He looked at her, eyes soft. "You found your way back," he said. She smiled, slipping her fingers into his. "I never really left." And in that final hush of evening, with the snow quiet beneath their boots and love settling warm into their bones, Jesse Callahan understood something he never thought he would. Forever isn't always lost. Sometimes it just takes the long way home.